All right, so the question is about me as a writer as opposed to me as a businesswoman. I think with the second business, I found I was older, it was bigger. I had less time to be the writer that I wanted to be, and still want to be. So when I think back, there's never been a time in my adolescent life through my adult life that I haven't written. Whether I've written better at certain times than others, I suppose that for debate. But it's never left me that need to write and the need to put words on a page. I think the thing about writing is I always joke about being Harriet Dorr because my kids always came first. My parents always came first, my friends. And so writing, I was willing to put off to that time in my life where I could focus more. I used to go to the Iowa City Writers Conference, which was such an amazing gift to myself, and actually in a way a gift to my daughters, because they saw that it mattered to me to be that writer, and that sometimes you have to carve out time and space to show your own self that it matters. So I would go to Iowa, and you always had to submit. I was writing short stories at the time and novellas, and you'd have to submit, and then the professor would kind of send you a small critique back, and you knew kind of what to expect, and you try to edit and do a new draft before you got down there. But then you were, thrown into this room, and I would go for the week-long workshop, and you were thrown into a room with people who, like yourself, had lives that weren't all about writing, but they were lawyers or doctors or teachers or parents or farmers, but they always felt that need to write and to tell a story. And you were lucky enough to be in a room with 13 to 20 of them, and the deal was you would all submit your stories, and everyone would have to, the rule, and I loved it, was you read it once, no comment. You read it twice, you started to frame maybe little notes on the page. And then the third time is when you started to write your criticism of somebody else's work. And it was wonderful because it taught you how to look at your own work too. When you were writing in isolation, you had those tools to go back to. And there were many great people and many great writers who probably, some are published now, I've seen their work, and others probably will never be published. And I think publication wasn't the everything. It was a way to put your life and the world into perspective. So now, with the new business having less time than I like, I'm writing poetry. I still think my heart is really in short story, but that maybe will come back down the road. But poetry is almost harder. You have to define your world in a shorter, more concise space, and it does make you think about what matters to you. I don't want to write about the big epic events in life because they're too hard to cover. And I think we talked about this the last time, is that when you take a really huge story, whether it's, let's just use Black Lives Matter, because that's huge right now, but how do you tell that story nationwide, citywide, neighborhood-wide, without losing focus? So the notion of taking a close, tight-up look at that and telling the story of one person's response to it, or maybe a group of 3 or 4, and you can actually get into the detail. And sometimes I think you can get the importance of that, of your, your beliefs across by telling the smaller story with smaller words. You don't have to have that epic arch. So I tend to like small things, and when I look at my life, sometimes it's the small things that have helped me face the big things. So the writing has taught me how to live in a way too that I probably wouldn't have adapted to without having been a writer for 50 years. I think it's interesting that over time, I remember Hyde Erdick. We were reading together at the old Opposable Thumbs bookstore, and I had been writing. I had just begun the transfer, or the change from fiction to poetry, and I still wanted to write like a fiction writer. And her taking me aside at the end of the reading and saying, "Your stories are great, but you need to look at minimalism as opposed to maximalism," which I suppose was the way she viewed it. And when I look back, yes, I jokingly refer to it as my Neruda period, because yes, it was all flowery and romantic and kind of overly written. Now, when I write sparse. It's beautiful in a way that I never thought I would see it as being. Just sometimes 6 lines on a page, it's like a 5-page short story, and I'm learning to appreciate it more. I don't know what else to say about writing and me. I might need a prompt there.
Well, let's grab something from Faulkner, from that famous Nobel speech, where something like, "This work has been produced with considerable trouble to uplift men's minds." So, I mean, are you an evangelist in some sense? Are you are you going to, if you get a Nobel Prize, do you get to are you going to stand up and say, "My work has been produced with considerable trouble to uplift men's minds"?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I would hope that I would write to uplift men and women's lives, but I think I write more to call them out on their crap and on their bad behaviors, or to commend them on their good behaviors. Gosh, I that's a wonderful quote by Faulkner. I love that. And I think that a great many writers like him did write to try to uplift. And I think of maybe this last decade, that's kind of gone by the wayside. I see now, like, fiction, I'm going back to the old guys because I think that's where my heart lies and where I have a deeper connection. It's like some of the newer fiction seems pretty self-absorbed, and it doesn't call people out, and it isn't about uplifting. It's kind of this kind of just obsessive examination of self and how I fit into the world. And I mean, I suppose that's a subject matter that has been covered, but maybe a little more, thoroughly by great writers in the past. But I think when I think of like writers that mean something to me, it's like Roth, it's like Updike, it's just Garcia Marquez, people who talk and matter. They marry politics and culture and anthropology to tell their story so others can understand it. I always think of the Rabbit series by Updike as being probably the best history book anyone could read about that, certain from the 50s through the end of the millennium. There's the kind of capturing of what America was going through, how it was changing, how it, in some sense, I want to say, was losing its heart and soul. And you couldn't find a history book that captured it better. It also was very dark, and I don't consider it to be very uplifting. But it sure was a great ride, that reading. And I think the other one that stands out would be The Human Stain. Just a kind of going inward and being self-absorbed in so many ways too in that novel, but looking at its impact on the world around him, and all of the lies and the secrets and how that played out in that novel. That was just sort of incredible. I'd like to believe that I could get to that point as a writer. I don't know if I can do it until I actually stop working as a businesswoman. If I had a business partner and I could feel like I could step away and focus more on the writing, I think I'd be productive. Right now, I go home, I open my computer, and that's the other thing, a little side note. I used to love to write longhand, and it did something different to my brain. And the transfer of the practice of writing from a very physical thing on a legal pad to a computer, it almost, in my instance, almost short circuits it in a way. And I have to sit back sometimes and do a little pacing and walk away and just think, okay, pretend it's a notepad. Just write like it's your legal pad, and don't think about the technology involved. And I don't know why it undoes me, but it does undo me. There's kind of a lack of intimacy about it. The other hand is that you have just this immediate access to everything you've done, and there are things that you find that you really love, but you know it doesn't fit that piece that you're working on at the time. So you cut and paste, and you just eradicate it from the work, and then I throw it into what I call my scrap heap. And I love that sometimes I'll just go to the scrap heap when I'm not sure how to start something, or I don't know what I want to write about. And sometimes just that little snippet that you've thrown away from another larger piece stands so clean and so good on its own that I think, oh my God, as the fiction writer in me doesn't understand that that's a finished work as a poem, and let it be. And so, I don't know, I think I have so much to learn still. I would love to go back to a writing class and just work. I think even not a writing class as much as everybody thinks writers work best alone, but I don't think that's true. I think you, like any other thing in your life, you need interaction and you need feedback. And to have somebody who is like-minded to help you critique, and by criticism I mean honest criticism, not just, oh, that's a lovely piece, great idea. I want somebody to tear my words apart and put them back together and show me where I went wrong, where it's not about time or place anymore, or it's not about an event. It kind of is, it's fuzzy and unfocused. I want a fellow writer to help me get back on track. And so I miss that. And I think, if in this next year, I would love to find a couple of writers who are in the same boat and who just need that extra little push to kind of go to the next level and to really rededicate to the craft of writing. I had a professor in the master's program at the University of Minnesota named Valerie Miner years ago, and she was an amazing writer. And she understood that I was working, and I had two kids, and it was my father was very ill, and I just felt like I was pulled in too many directions to really be focused on my writing. And I remember her taking me aside after class one night and saying, you have the tools that you need to be a good writer. You are a good writer. You just don't have the time or the focus. And at some point in your life, you'll have to figure out, this is the time, and this is how I focus. and you'll be fine. And I hope she's right. I feel like I'm getting there. After 4 years of this business being up and on its own and having great employees, I finally feel like I can take a deep breath and step back and not have to live my life like focused about are the orders done, are the customers happy. I know the customers are happy because the kids are great with them. The mechanics of running the business have kind of worked themselves out, and there's a system. So now I would say it's probably 4 nights a week now instead of 2, that I just take my 3-hour window and shut my phone off and put music on in the background, and it's all about putting that word down and trying to capture something that mattered from this week.
So, what's at stake in staying with the business?
What's at stake? Well, it's my livelihood. Single, and I don't have any resources to just say, oh, I'm just going to be a writer. Although in my fantasy world, I have done that.
So So if you had a MacArthur, you'd quit
if
tomorrow?
I had a grant, I would step back. Here's the funny thing about the business. I love my customers. I love my employees. I love how it engages everybody who comes in somehow into being a part of a community, which also feeds the writer. You see things happen that strike you, and like you said, small things, big things, horrific things, wonderful things, and it's all kind of goes back into your heart or your head, and you pull it out later when you're trying to write. So it does feed that. But if I could, I joke that next year I am going to kill the last of my 401k. I am going to go spend a month in Italy, and I'm going to do nothing but look at beauty and write and eat. And seriously, my fantasy is to go for a month. I will have friends there for part of it, probably 10 days of it, and then to be that hermit with a notebook, just back to an old notebook, looking at everything around me, listening, smelling, seeing, and then just saying, okay, for 3 weeks now, your life is about writing and nothing else, and just absorbing for later writing. And I think I am going to do it. Come hell or high water, if I have to rob a bank, I'm going. I'm not really going to rob a bank, but I will kill that 401k because I learned last year, in fact, yesterday was the anniversary. I had emergency surgery, and I was pretty sure I had cancer and was going to die. And in the recovery period, you kind of focus in and you go inward and you think, okay, what's important now? If I do have cancer and they can't fix me, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And it was to tell my friends and my children and my family how much I love them, show them how much I love them, and then to write what mattered in my life down. Whether it was a poem, a short story, a letter to the people who had the most impact, those friends who have always been there, to try to tell your children, which is interesting because I have 2 daughters and they know their mom. They know about their mom. They don't know a lot about their mom. So you edit, you think, you sort. How do you paint a picture so that your children really do understand you? They understand why you were driven to open that business, why you chose to live where you lived, why you divorced, why you believe in humanity. So a well-rounded sense of what a person is. I look at my mother, and I understand my mother, and I love her, and I think I know her in ways that sometimes surprise me, because she'll say things now in her 80s with end-stage kidney disease that she would have never said 20 years ago. So it has allowed a certain openness, and I'd like that with my daughters too. I'd like to put it on paper. I keep trying to talk my mom into put this stuff in a journal. If you don't want to write a story, just put it down. She's wonderful with words. She's always been wonderful with words, but I think she's more concerned with privacy than with leaving a legacy. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's part of it. And I feel like we're losing a huge part of our family, of understanding our family, of understanding the truth behind that, that polite social story that's put out there. And when you look at the family, there's so much going on in there. And maybe that was the other thing. There's so many secrets. There's so many untold stories. There's, my grandfather had a life. My grandmother, there's a story there. She kind of, I think, ran the alderman in the old neighborhood. She had bathtub gin. She was political before women were supposed to be political. And she was powerful in that community. I know that because sometimes the aunties and uncles have a couple of cocktails and will blurt little stories out. But nobody has taken the time to write that down. So I think it does matter. And I'd like to maybe tell their story. I don't know. Maybe that's why I've always written. To kind of all those stories that nobody looked at. To try to capture them.
My last big writer interview is one I do every year with a friend who writes beautifully, Katrina Vandenberg. And her story was about, the big news for the year was burning a lot of journals.
Wow.
And she went through and pulled stuff that was important and then burned the rest.
Wow.
And it was, to some extent, a concern of privacy. I'm wondering if you give that any weight.
Yes, and I'm going to say this and realize that there are many secrets in my family. And you try to honor some of them and you wait out others because you figure, okay, when that generation is gone, the secrets don't matter anymore. The secrets that people have always hidden, I've never cared about. I mean, I'm not embarrassed by them. But I think it leads to an incomplete life. All that, and at what point do I want to hurt my mother or father or anybody? No, I don't. But at what point do you claim your own life versus protecting somebody else's life? And that's, to me, the kind of my critical issue, because it's not, they're intertwined in how much right do I have to tell my story when it hurts that person to tell the truth. So yeah, I kind of get why she burned a lot of the journals. I don't know if I'll burn them. There are certain things, yeah, I will never tell my kids and probably my family and certain friends. But I think the other flip side of that is something that is such a critical part of your life, to have had to bury it, hide it, censor it, and never be honest about it. It's like it's sitting there waiting to be let loose and to be told. And maybe that's what in my head the Italy is. If a different time, different place allows for a level of honesty that sometimes here I don't feel like I have, right? At least not yet. I think everybody who writes probably has those stories and secrets that you self-censor.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that came up in this conversation with her was just the sense, I don't know if it was entirely, I don't know if I got it entirely right, but something like, as a writer, you write a whole lot of your momentary thoughts in a journal.
Yeah.
And not all of those momentary thoughts are things that you would stand behind or even particularly like or respect. There's the stuff you got through on the way, and to have Bobby or Susie open it up to page 36 and discover
that guy's such an asshole. I really can't stand them. Actually, you love them. I totally understand.
And especially if you're married.
Very true. Very true. Oh yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's why I don't have a journal anymore as far as recording the instances of my life. I think I actually understand because I probably got rid of mine maybe 2 years after my divorce. And I think I used them, to try to track my life and sort my life and understand my place in my world, my marriage, as a mom, as a daughter. When I figured I knew where I was, I went from journaling to writing as just kind of a snippet of a small drawing or caricature photograph, an image of a time and place that didn't really necessarily lash out at anybody. If I was angry, I might be angry at the world, or I might be angry at myself, or the way business was playing out, but I didn't have to rant about that in a journal anymore. Instead, I could write a poem about something that was unsettling or that I was not pleased with. And it kind of gave me distance, and it let me step away from, just eating that anger and keeping it inside. I could put it on the page and then go, oh, okay, it's out there. Yeah, of course you're angry at that. Or, oh, you thought this was wonderful, and this is why you thought it was wonderful. And it's really fun to go back, and especially like when I'm tired and my sensors are down, and I'm not so concerned about, oh my God, am I going to like that? When I open it up again, am I going to be absolutely disappointed? There's something about, it's kind of like Twilight. Everything's a little, softer. And so you go back and you look, and sometimes I just laugh at what I've written because it's so bad. But other times it's just, it's far more beautiful than I thought it was going to be. And that I remembered what I was trying to write about. And I was like, did I write that? Or was that, no, that I wrote that. And it's like rediscovering something that you loved that you lost. And there it is, and it's better than you remembered, and it's wonderful. On the flip side, sometimes it's like, oh my God, that goes to the scrap heap and you never resurrect it. That one, you just said it and it's gone. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you do have to, what's the phrase, kill your darlings and never allow them back in that door. Mm-hmm. But no, it's writing. It's the best and worst of an endeavor in life. I mean, because it's isolative sometimes, and yet it brings you together in a way that other things probably don't.
This move from journal to other ways of writing. I mean, as somebody who's fooling around with journals, and mm-hmm. sometimes I get a sentence and then I move on to something else. Right. And sometimes it's just a string of sentences and then I go back and one of them turns into a paragraph. But I never think of it these days as producing a piece. And so, I don't produce a piece unless somebody calls and says, I want a piece on something, or there's we're publishing this thing and we'd like you to do a piece, which doesn't happen very often. But, then I maybe a bunch of these things kind of come together, but I open a fresh page and it's a piece. Right. It's sounding to me like, and I just want to check this out, like, the way you think about writing is more pieces mm-hmm. that you may abandon or you might move on to another piece, but you're always thinking about it as, in some sense, a piece of writing.
I guess I am, and I think it's always saying that. usually part of a bigger picture too, or not on a larger piece or body of work. I mean, when I'll go on, I suppose, kind of streams of writing where, for whatever reason, something has happened, and whether it's conscious or unconscious, I find myself writing about something fairly specific, and I'll try to view it from, let's say, that guy's perspective, and how would he react, and then my perspective. Let's say, one of my customers who I really don't know that well, but I'm going to imagine this is how they would respond to this, and then how would my mother or my daughter. So I will write pieces with points of view because it makes me, I think, define myself and really where I land to, and it also helps me to understand points of view that would not normally occur to me except for to put them in another character's mouth. And it doesn't always have to be, maybe that character is a compilation of 5 or 6 different customers and some of the things they have said throughout the course of the day, and then you kind of string together a loose character that would fit that piece, and then you write to that. And I guess the other thing that this makes me realize is that I'm probably a lot more political in my writing than I realize, because a lot of it, I guess, is about feminist politics or racial politics or justice. I mean, it's just, there's small little things that happen, but really at the base of it, yeah, I think that's probably true. And whether that's a good thing or not, I couldn't tell you, but it's kind of my core, and it's what probably pushes me to write more than anything else. But the notion of pieces, if you fit that in like a puzzle to a larger picture, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about your mother and your the impulse to kind of push her to write, my mother's a writer, and she doesn't write much anymore, but she still has, I think, the narrative gift, and so I turn on the tape recorder sometimes, and I can get things that way. Just wondering how you think about the relation between writing and storytelling, and is there a way in which a bunch of audio tapes wouldn't be enough?
Well, I think they're two different. I mean, yes, you're always telling a story when you're writing, but there's I think it's a different skill set, a different comfort level in dealing, like people who are storytellers and who go to a live audience and tell stories. To me, that is frightening. That is, I'm a talker. I've been a talker my whole life, but to do it in front of an audience is intimidating. Even to do it in front of a camera, and you create a very comfortable vibe here. So I don't feel the normal fear I think I would have felt imagining doing this, and I give you all the credit for that. But I think I could never be that storyteller out in the world on a stage. I want the privacy of my thoughts in a room where I can sort and maybe help clarify. And I don't think that skill set of being that storyteller out in the public eye, boy, you'd have to be very practiced and quick on your feet to do that. It's a skill set I don't think I have.
So, is editing a big part of your writing? I mean, do you spend a lot of time going back and revisiting and worrying about about in some sense changing it?
Right. I think, yeah, I suppose all editing is the same, but I think my head works differently when I'm editing fiction versus poetry. When I'm doing fiction, it's more how it fits in the timeline of that piece, or how is it true to place? Is it true to character? When it's a poem. Yes, sometimes there's a character in that poem, but it's more about, is the idea coming across? Just that specific, whatever I'm going for, is that metaphor working? So there's kind of, it's a different mindset, I guess. But yeah, I do edit, and sometimes I think that is your biggest curse, knowing when to. I also paint and draw, and knowing when to step away from anything, whether it's words on a page or chalk on paper or an ink wash, before you just make it all muddy and murky and it's gone. What was a great thing is now just murky, and you've overworked it, and you have to throw it because it's no longer what it was meant to be. So yeah, editing, I don't think I've ever, maybe once, written a poem. This was, years ago, that I looked at it on the page, I walked away, and I put it away probably for a week, went back 2 weeks later, because I thought, well, you can't be right. You don't want to change anything. And it was the one piece I wrote probably in my entire life that I didn't change a word, and I still love to this day. And I was probably 25 when I wrote it. Only once.
And how do you think about this matter of audience? I mean, I think about my mother. My mother and dad both wrote for the Litchfield area adult writers group.
Okay.
And that meant that there was an audience once a month, and everybody had 5 minutes, and that was the point. Why I write? Well, because I gotta have something when they come around to me. Right. But wondering how you think about that.
I've written pieces that have been published in educational magazines or journals. I wrote for a George Lucas thing. It was the first big buck thing I ever wrote, and got paid really good money for it. And it was probably, way back in the mid 80s, late 80s. Actually late 80s, early 90s, and we were trying to do something in education that, probably people were not comfortable with changing things, and it was to talk about bringing communities and families in, and understanding that you were, in dealing with that kid in the classroom, you were dealing with just that kid in the classroom, but you weren't going to change anything essential about his life or better his or her life if you didn't look at the community that kid came from, the surrounding family, the chaos or the strengths. You couldn't, working in isolation, you did nothing. So when we started bringing families in and helping the entire family function, you saw remarkable things happening. So George Lucas's foundation kind of heard about this, and they wanted a piece on it. And it was daunting, and it was paralyzing, because I was like, how do you take the amazing stuff that was happening with families that were real life people who you loved and you cared about, and make somebody else care in the same way, and understand that this practice is the best practice and you should be doing it too, whether you're in California or Connecticut. And I remember writing, and it was like 5-page thing, and it was very fact-driven but emotional, and talked about data with, how things change with families, how, the bad behavioral issues were, dropping off, their grade point averages were going up, families were becoming employed. But also talking about it emotionally in context of the community, and how it changed the community, and how the parents were finally hopeful. And I remember sending it off to Lucas's editors, and I got this, wonderful piece, and oh my God, it's just striking and so emotional. And then they kept editing and sending it back to me, and editing and sending it back to me. And it was this cold and analytical piece at the end that didn't capture anything about those amazing families and the teachers who were working with them. And I was like, well, this is garbage. And it's cold, and it means nothing. And they're like, it's educational, Mary. And they paid me my money and said, we own it now. And I was livid. And it made me wonder, a great deal about some of the editing processes and whether, okay, it's different apparently for analytic educational materials versus a story. And I wanted that to be a story about these kids, not some data-driven piece where nobody would pay attention to how important it was to the families. So yeah, it was a life lesson, and I don't ever want to be that kind of editor.
I hope you write that piece someday.
Oh, it's published, and I actually fought and won. Some of the emotion came back to it. It's in one of his books, and it's. I still stand by it. It is not what it could have been, though. Oh well.
Well, I mean, when I read people talking about their writing process, some people come real close to canonizing their editors. I mean, the thanks that editors get, and it's clear it's sincere.
Oh, yeah.
You ever had one of those?
Actually, yes. There was a couple of the writers down in the Iowa Writers Workshop, and one of the authors, Mr. Manager was his name. He was Professor Manager. He was an amazing writer, and I was working on a short story, and it was probably too close to home. It was about a friend who had blown his head off in front of his wife, and was a dear friend to us, and my kids loved him, and he was a cowboy and bigger than life, and it's probably subject matter that I needed to step away from for a while, but I didn't, because I needed to try to deal with his death. And I took the story with me to Iowa, and I felt lost, but it was an important story to me, and I gave it to the group. And when we came back, because we all did our turn, and everybody was silent in the room, and I was like, oh, nobody liked it. And they're like, no, it was just so raw. We don't know what to tell you to do with it. Whereas the instructor was like, he's like, yes. It was like getting kicked in the teeth because, man, this was a hard loss. You can feel that. He goes, but this is what all of you need to do. And he had written like a 5-page critique. And he was so spot on as far as, where it was too emotional, where I needed to step back, where it was about, it lost focus on the character, and it was, kind of murky. And I went, and it probably took me 6 months when I left and went back home to rewrite it and to then submit the next year again. And it was a tight, solid story, and it meant what it was supposed to mean, and it was clean, and it worked. And I thought, oh, that guy, I want him to edit every single thing I write for the rest of my life. But of course, I would have had to stay and do a master's at Iowa in Huet Thang. I was mom. But yeah, I totally understand that, because it was the first time, other than Valerie Miner, who was a professor up here, really helped you focus and feel that you dared think of yourself as a writer, because you actually could put a story together on a page that mattered. And that's important.
Well, that's sort of the temptation to get into a serious relationship with a publisher.
Right.
I mean, the person, I remember, recent visitor to the Twin Cities, has had, that relationship with a woman for decades.
Wow.
And, with that kind of trust and that kind of, constant support and enough money in the transaction that
Right.
you can go back and you can revisit a lot
Right.
of times.
Right, and actually have the time to write full time. I think, I look at all these people with grants, and I think, they've worked hard, they earn them. And I've never applied for one because, I was always busy being a mom or a daughter or a business owner. But, maybe the joke is when I get back from Italy, that'll be the impetus to find the time and make it the priority. I can't be Harriet Dorr if I don't.
Right. Now, I got to ask about Italy, because, I mean, is there any sense in which this is a sort of a religious pilgrimage, or is it purely a different kind of thing?
I wouldn't call it a religious. It's a sense of self-discovery again. I think I was lucky enough my senior year in college to one of my dear friends said, "Oh, I think we should go to Europe." And I was like, "Absolutely." But we started looking at St. John's study abroad programs, and none of us wanted to go to Chartres or to Geneva or Salzburg. And we're like, well, that's not appealing. I want to go to all those places. So Mark, who was a genius and a smooth tacker, went to the dean of students and said, "I think we should just go and do independent study for a year, and we'll check in with you throughout Europe." And the dean was like, "That's a genius idea." So 5 of us ended up doing that. And we started out in London where, someday I'm going to write this story. Mark, the same genius, smooth tacker, we got off the train at the train station, and he's like, "I found this really nice guy. He's got a room, so we'll just stay in the room." Well, it was a brothel. So we spent the first 5 nights in London in this very hilarious Indian man's little brothel, and we just roared. And we would go out every day when we realized what was going on, and we'd think, this is someday this will be a story. Anyway, so that was our introduction to Europe. And then we went all over. We traveled and Scotland and on to Austria, and we were heading, I think we had gone to Spain, and we were heading to Italy. And we were, I think, 2 nights in Italy when one of the 5 of us, who was an artist and is an architect and does historic restoration now, developed spinal meningitis. And we were staying at this pension in Florence, and Mario Panici owned the pension. And I remember one of the guys, because there was a guy's dorm and a girl's dorm, and one of the men from the men's dorm came knocking on my door in the girl's dorm and said, "I think something's terribly wrong with your friend." And I remember one of the women in my dorm was a nurse, and we had been talking, and I said, "Would you come with me?" We went back, and he was hallucinating and writhing in pain, and she's like, "I think he has meningitis." He couldn't turn his head. He was crazy. So we asked for an ambulance to come, and first it was a surreal experience. It was a group that they took vows of silence, and they wore capes and hoods like the Ku Klux Klan, but with huge rosaries wrapped around them. And they put him into a straitjacket, screaming. I rode with in the ambulance. We spent 12 hours in the emergency room with me speaking very little Italian, Richard screaming, people bleeding out next to us, and it was a frightening, horrific experience. And then a young doc came in, and he had very little English, but he knew that Dick was very sick, and got us through this crazy, kind of like Dante's hell of waiting in the emergency room, and started treating Dick for the spinal meningitis. I don't think I left the hospital for 3 days. Dick ended up moving to a sanitarium up in the hills by Fiesole, and so I would do the daily run to take care of him and be with him in the hospital. So I spent a month probably just living in hospitals in Florence and outside of Florence, whereas the other 3 had been traveling, and they kind of came and left. We were, my ex-husband actually was one of the ones we were put in quarantine, and so we would take turns taking care of Richard. And when the rest of them came back and it was our turn to travel outside and go to Spain, go to wherever, by that time, my days when my ex was taking care of Dick and I was wandering the streets of Florence, I didn't want to go anywhere else. I just wanted to learn everything I could about Italy and Firenze, and the city I would wander for 10 hours. And so for me, going back there is like rediscovering something about myself, and about when you're that kind of Minnesota shy, quiet Catholic girl who goes away to a foreign country and you face the strangest things you've ever faced in your life, and you think your friend is going to die, and you are put in quarantine with a guy who you go to school with but you're not serious about it, and then all of a sudden, okay, you start courting. It was an interesting time, and I would like to go back there and just see how much of it was me and how much was time and place. But it was a place I felt like I had come home to, and I felt like I knew it in my bones when I wandered those streets, and it gave me a sense of purpose. So yeah, that's why the need, and everybody's like, but you're Irish, you should go to Ireland. I want to go back to Italy, and I want particular to do Firenze and then the coast, Portofino, and maybe if I'm lucky, get all the way down to Sicily. Mm. But I think it feels like I'm going to go home.
Huh. We should all have a place like that.
Yeah.
A second place.
Exactly.
Yeah. Though, having visited your coffee shop, I think you create a place that feels like home.
Well, Italy is the reason why I have my coffee shop. I think it taught me when I went there, when Dick was hospitalized and everybody was gone, and there was a little neighborhood coffee shop. It was like 2 doors down, and you could tell it was a mom and pop place, and they knew everybody in their neighborhood. And like I said, I spoke Spanish, but my Italian was pretty rusty, and I could catch little bits of this and that. But you understood immediately that they cared about their community. They knew their neighbors. That you'd see the guy, like somebody's sad story. You could tell tone of voice even though you didn't know the words. And then he'd be pulling out money and giving it to the guy, patting him on the back, and you'd know the guy was saying, "Oh, I'll pay you back. Don't worry, you just take care of what you have to take care of." And over the course of the 3 months there, you saw it was family, it was community, and they took care of me too. I mean, they knew that my friend was sick, and they knew that I was terrified that my friend was going to die, and they would, bring me little treats and make me extra cappuccino, and just were very warm and loving and kind when they didn't need to be. But I think that's just what they were. That's who they were, and it mattered that they were kind. So that always stuck with me. And my first coffee shop, my second, iteration of the first one, and now this, it's about recreating that sense of community always.
I think my son's experience as a writer, I mean, he worked at, the polar opposite from your place. It's 99 miles to Philly. Oh. Cheesesteak sandwich shop. Okay. High volume, in the middle of Manhattan. Boy. And, he was running out with a beautiful community of Spanish-speaking people putting the sandwiches together and playing all the games that outsiders play. But what was striking is, he would run off with these stories of all of the things he hated to put on the stage.
Well, it's easier to parody what you hate because you don't have that sense of having to do it justice. Whereas things you love, it's different somehow. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, you talked about calling people on their crap. Do you? Do you do a certain amount of writing out of something approaching hate?
Oh, I don't think hate. Years ago, I had probably, if I was ever going to hate, was in the middle of my divorce. And I decided and made a very conscious decision that that was poison and that it only hurt everyone around you. It would hurt my kids and it would only make me something I didn't want to be. So I actually had tattooed with a Da Vinci, with Michael, the Archangel, Nunca cede odium, which means never surrender to hate, on my back as a constant reminder that gets you nowhere. I write perhaps out of fear or out of empathy, humor, but hatred, I can portray hate in the character, but I don't write from a place of hate.
So how is it with the relationship between your writing and the shop? I mean, do the people see it ever? Do they show up in it? Do they ask about what you're doing once they realize that you do a little more than just serving coffee and making sandwiches?
I think more so at the old place, yes. A lot of the customers knew that I was a writer. And because I did readings always at my business. Poetry and open mics, you name it, we've always had that. But I rarely read at the new place. That's for the other poets and writers. So the new people and the new iteration about, no, they don't know as much as the old ones. The old ones follow though, and that's funny because they'll when I would read and they go, oh, that's about so and so. I'm like, maybe it's about a couple of different people combined. But yeah, they'd see themselves sometimes or others.
Yeah. And how did that go when they saw themselves?
I think because if they saw themselves, generally it was something that was humorous, and they were okay with that. And I always go back to an old writing teacher, Ian. God, Ian, what was your last name? Shame on me. But I remember he wrote a collection of short stories called The Wounded. And it was about his drunken, crazy Scottish family or Welsh family. And he was like, oh my God, when I publish this, they're never going to speak to me again. And he sent copies off to his family. And the thing that made me think, you can probably say anything always and don't worry about the editing, although I do, is that the response from his siblings and his parents and his friends were like, how do you make up people like this? And he goes, I didn't make up any of them. They were all based on my own family and my friends. But none of them wanted to see themselves in those characters. So they didn't see themselves in those characters. So I think that's probably a pretty common occurrence, is that nobody wants to see themselves in poor light, so that, or badly portrayed. So they just say, oh, that's not me. Who is that?
Last question. I've gotten to visit in the last while and revisit an old friend, Gerald Durrell, who wrote My Family and Other Animals. And going back to that stuff set in Greece, I realized he takes you into a different world.
Right.
He takes you into, it's very much like Alice in Wonderland. It's like meeting the White Rabbit. It's like seeing people playing croquet with birds. It's that crazy. And yet, he's telling something that actually happened. And that's weird.
It's weird, but it's fabulous. And I think, would you take something like magical realism? Like, let's take 100 Years of Solitude. I remember when I first moved to Puerto Rico and my husband's family, it was like you lost 2 centuries. You were back in time, and they were very insular. And one of the sons had died, and the room was kept exactly as it was the day he fell and was crushed by rocks in this horrific accident. And the you could never wear anything but black. You could not have music in the house. This was decades later, and nothing. And it was like, I remember walking in, and it was like time had it stopped, and I said to him, "Oh my God, your family is 100 years of solitude, but they don't levitate." And and he laughed and he said, "Ouch. Yeah, it's pretty true." And then he goes, "And your family is very old bones," by Kennedy. And I was like, touche, fair enough. But yes, when even magical realism can seem so real, and you see it and you're like, "Oh my God, I know those people. I live among them." That's the kind of writing I want to do. I mean, not so much magical realism, but that people understand that that's my life too. And so you can put it, and sometimes when you see it as somebody else's life, but you can relate to it, it makes your life better or more meaningful.
Thank you.
Thank you.